I was really brief before when I introduced myself because I didn't want to anticipate anything for on my talk. And so I would like to start by introducing myself again. I'm Maria, I'm a specialized translator, and at present I'm a PhD student in international studies. My research fields are translation studies, cultural and post-colonial studies, deconstruction, and attitude feminine. My scientific activities focus on the academic studies of themes related to world literatures, specifically the analysis of the pragmatic aspects that characterize Anglophone post-colonial narrative, and the ethical responsibility of the translator in the context of post-colonial translation theory and practice. The perspective of my research is applied interdisciplinary approaches of cultural studies in order to focus on the relationship between discourse, power, and dominance. In particular, my areas of interest identify with the critique of historical representation, the deconstruction of the power and the authority of the archive, and the rewritings of history aiming at restoring its complexity and its vocal plurality. So, investigating contemporary radical thoughts and practices that seek to disrupt history's presumption of universality in order to recognize its intrinsic plurality, specifically the question of how to intervene in the archive by producing rereadings, revisions, and experimental poetics as a new ethical historical practice. In this sense, the contemporary critical literary experimentations that try to recover the histories that have never been entirely told in the colonial archive offer an extraordinary example of poetics, which is central in this engagement with the responsibility and the burden of history and representation. Through the analysis of the critical fabulation, the speculative method proposed by the historian Saidiya Hartman, I intend to examine the possibilities of reconstructing, without replicating its grammar, the history of quotidian violence, injustice, and dominations experienced by Black community during the transatlantic slave trade and later in the afterlife of slavery. But most importantly, I try to highlight how Hartman crafts a counter-narrative that offers an intimate chronicle of Black radicalism, liberated from judgment, classification, and prejudice, which describe Black people as promiscuous, reckless, wild, and wayward. I can't understand. Okay, maybe now the vector and
Right.
Now, whose voice is heard and whose is silent? According to Hartman, the very effort to represent the situation of a subaltern reveals the professionality of the archive, as well as the interests that shape it and determine the emplotment of history. In his essay La historia como ficción, la ficción como historia, José Saramago, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998, notes that though we tend to classify history as an objective science, history is not the past. Actually, history itself is a narration. In their accounts of the past, historians place events in an established order, which is based on ideological, social, and cultural choices. By selecting, choosing, including or excluding, their fictional creations also claim the sovereignty of a single story, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie puts it in her 2009 TED Talk entitled The Danger of a Single Story. This means that historians emplot history, as Aidan White famously pointed out, by elaborating facts and ideologies, strategies that are similarly employed by literature. Indeed, as Saramago argues, history is not different from fiction. They both share a rarefaction of the referrer. Okay, it doesn't work. Okay. Such concerns about the ethics of historical representation share the conviction of many African-American radical thinkers that try to remake and re-envision the modern world through social movements, art, literature, and study in action. Thinking that another world is possible is first of all an imaginative task, and the reconfiguration of history cannot but be enacted by means of further imaginations and new experiments. Drawing on personal, cultural, and archival memory, as well as creativity, Black Atlantic radical writers and thinkers offer a rereading of history to acknowledge the existence of other stories, other voices, and other sounds. In their efforts to queer the historical archive, to disrupt hegemonic historical paradigms, and to deconstruct official historiographies, these writers and artists transform a painful legacy into works of extraordinary beauty, giving birth to a new Black aesthetic. But how can this experimentation travel the line between history and imagination? Imagination, fabulation, and speculation can play a central role by marking and seeking to fill the gaps of the colonial archive. If in the past fabulation, deriving from the Latin word fabula, indicated the act of fabricating false stories, today the term is placed at the heart of a radical ethic of historical representation, which tries to recover the lives of the unnamed and the forgotten in order to shape a counter-history of the human. In 2008, Saidiya Hartman proposes a historical method of critical fabulation in the essay Venus in Slats. Though some instances of a new methodology can be traced in her previous books, Sins of Subjection and Illusory Magas. Hartman claims, I think of my work as bridging theory and narrative. In fact, critical fabulation refers to a writing that combines historical and archival research with critical theory and fictional narrative. Specifically, Hartman's scholarly practice wants to make a productive sense of the gaps and silences in the archive of transatlantic slavery that negate and silence the voices of so many enslaved people, notably women. Undertaking archival work, Saidiya Hartman reads the official historical documents against the grain. She denounces the distortions of national history, and by intertwining storytelling, visuality, and speculation, she highlights the relationship between power and voice. As Gayatri Spivak remarks, the subaltern cannot appear without the thought of the elite. Following her wake as a scholar of African American history, Hartman points out that the history of the oppressed is rarely autobiographical, but always written by the oppressor himself. The stories that exist are never about them, but rather about violence and brutal excess that transform them into commodities, numbers, ciphers, units of value, corpses, and property. The libidinal investment in violence is everywhere appearing in the documents, statements, and institutions that decide our knowledge of the past. Her focus is on the constraints that determine what can be said and whose perspective matters. So, riding at the edge of the unspeakable and the unknown, Hartman challenges the one-way representation built on the marginalization of historical events and actors. Nevertheless, she knows that a wayward method might be an impossible enterprise and must be considered a less legitimate method of writing history. She is also aware of the risk of reinforcing the authority of the official documents, though she uses them for opposing purposes. She writes, I intended both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its death. In Sins of Subjection, her first book published in 1997, she states, the documents, fragments, and accounts considered here, although claimed for purposes contrary to those for which they were gathered, nonetheless they remain entangled with the politics of domination. In this regard, the effort to reconstruct the history of the dominated is not discontinuous with dominant accounts or official history, but rather it is a struggle within and against the constraints and silences imposed by the nature of the archive, the system that governs the appearance of statements and generates social media. And then she wonders, how does one use these sources? At best, with the awareness that the totalizing history cannot be reconstructed from these interested, selective, and fragmentary accounts, and with an acknowledgement of the interventionist role of the interpreter, the equally interested labor of historical revision, and the impossibility of reconstructing the past free from the disfigurements of present concepts. With all these provisions issued, these narratives nonetheless remain an important source for understanding the everyday experience of slavery and its aftermath. I read these documents with the hope of gaining a glimpse of Black life during slavery and the postbellum period, while remaining aware of the impossibility of further reconstructing the experience of the enslaved. Therefore, critical fabulation is a way to engage with history. Hartman's exploration of the time of slavery cannot but highlight the relation between the past and the present, that is, the ways in which the present is still affected by the past. She writes, "My effort to reconstruct the past is as well an attempt to describe obliquely the forms of violence that has been present. Narrative is central to this effort because of the relation it poses, explicit or implied, between past, present, and future. As she explains in Minus into Acts, the very wayward work is the political and ethical relevance of the past. For me, narrating counter-histories of slavery has always been inseparable from writing history of present, by which I mean the incomplete project of freedom and the precarious life of the ex-slave, a condition defined by the vulnerability to premature death and to gratuitous acts of violence." The questions guiding Hartman's work are: why tell these stories? Why go back to this violence and these horrible periods? Did slavery really end? Racial subjection, incarceration, impoverishment, and second-class citizenship. This is the legacy of slavery that still owns us, the living presence of slavery. As Terry Morrison states, modern life begins with slavery. So, according to Hartman, trying to examine these instances, Black people might find a key to their identity. Sense of Subjection is a powerful exploration of slavery, freedom, and the long-lasting race relations in the United States. A masterpiece that pays attention to what carried on after the abolition of slavery, the ongoing forms of subjugation endured by ordinary Black people, and the regime of exclusions and coercion that had been at the heart of the liberal American state. In Sense, she examines what she calls the economy of enjoyment, the dichotomy of white enjoyment and Black subjections that characterized slavery. According to her analysis, Black performances for white audiences enacted a different kind of brutality and extreme domination, what Foucault defined as biopower, which is the display of violence against the enslaved that engendered sympathy or empathy in the white audiences, obfuscating the suffering of Blacks. The body of the slave, dancing and on display, seemingly revealed a comfort with bondage and a natural disposition for servitude. Negro enjoyment was a form of dominance and an instrument for contented subjection. Besides all that, Sinso also tries to illuminate the countless ways in which the enslaved challenged, refused, defied, and resisted the condition of enslavement and its ordering or negation of life. By refashioning Black performance, the enslaved enacted a counter-investment in body as a site of possibility and a practice of resistance, aiming at the refusal of the anatomopolitics that identifies the Black body as aberrant. In this regard, Hartman's hope is to illuminate the practice of everyday life, specifically tactics of resistance, modes of self-fashioning, and the figurations of freedom, and to investigate the construction of the subject. What is experienced in everyday life is that slavery still affects present and determines the fungibility and the precarity of Black life. Racism is not mere ideology, but a determining factor of social formation. We all live in a present determined by slavery and colonialism. As a response to the lack of representation of the Black woman in historical texts, Hartman chooses to imagine what cannot be fully verified, but might have happened to the thousands of people, specifically women, exposed to historical silencing. In Wayward Life, Beautiful Experiments, published in 2019 and winner among its many awards of the National Book Critics Circle Award 2019, she continues her reflection on the original process of critical fabulation by telling the semi-fictional but strongly historically formed post-slavery stories of Black women, their rebellious acts against segregation and patriarchy, the unfolding of their revolution in a minor key. Rather than focusing on the traditional political activities, such as the ones of the abolition movement, and thanks to the telling of ordinary girls' everyday practices and small acts of resistance, Hartman creates a rendering of wayward and beautiful lives that honors both the anonymity of some historical figures and together the ethical necessity of rewriting history. As she states, it is an impossible writing which attempts to say what resists being said by advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, a grammatical mood that expresses doubts, wishes, and possibilities, in fashioning a narrative which is based upon a critical reading of the archive. In this sense, she uses and develops the technique of critical fabulation, actively studying archives and a wide range of historical documents to fabulate stories based on the ones who have been forgotten or deemed unfit for history and destined to be minor figures. Her practice combines different genres and style, documentary, historical, sociological ones, in order to create stories that are as close as possible to the truth of the lives of Black individuals whose experiences of life have been lost and ignored throughout history. We Were Lives offers a new and profound approach to writing. Thanks to a method of close narration, Hartman recreates the voices and inhabits the intimate dimensions of these young women that at the turn of the 20th century were in open rebellion. She gives voice to their thoughts and desires, fears and wishes. It is a story told from inside the circle, a moving picture of the wayward, a love letter to all those who have been harmed. These women transcend the page. They seem to come alive and speak to us. Hartman's experimental and brilliant writing transcends the expected and usual and transforms facts and data into a three-dimensional living history. She offers us a visual prose of what life was really like for poor Black women during the early days of the last century. Her prose is soaked in orality and polyphony and seems to replicate the characteristics of Black music, improvisation, and polyrhythms. It is imbued with visuality, photos, letters, and newspaper clippings, quotations rendered with italics, and historical, ideological, cultural, political, and legal knowledge. With her description, Hartman makes us see the urban landscape from sounds that characterize the slum, smell the scents wafting through the air, feel the touch of a hand brushing against you. One of the images that she inserts in the book depicts the Atlantic, a wide and open space contrasting with the modest and restricted life of these existences and characterized Blackness. We Were Lives also deals with the question of the relationship between memory and photography. Wary of the endless pictures propelled by moralistic narratives of sexual promiscuity, improper guardianship, and the dangers of saloon, boarding houses, and tense boats, the visual cliches of damnation and salvation, images that never grasp the beautiful struggle to survive, but only documented ugliness, Hartman looked for photographs unequivocal in their representation of what it meant to live free for the second and third generations born after the official end of slavery. By retrieving photographs that represented the experiments in freedom that unfolded within slavery's shadow, and that would provide a necessary antidote to the bodies stripped and branded or rendered grotesque for white enjoyment, she creates a sort of alternative archive of history which defies common representations of Black life. Looking for the errant, the unruly, the fugitive, We Were Lives rescues the lives of young Black women from the margins of history. Concluding, narrative is central to the effort of rearranging and representing historical events from contested points of view. These counter-historical projects haven't yet been able to install themselves as history. They are still deemed insurgent, disruptive, and therefore marginalized. For this reason, it is important to continue the engagement in finding aesthetic modes suitable or adequate for rendering the lives of these Black people. After reading, researching, and attempting to understand the oppression of historical and current individuals, it can be said without fear of being contradicted that the dispossession of Black lives never stops, and that the hold of racism continues to shape their existence. In the face of this evidence, what is required is to keep rethinking the meaning of history, the meaning of narrative, rethinking the ethics of translation, and last but not least, rethinking the meaning of freedom. Thank you all. Thank you.